Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a big top 16 deck review. We're looking at the $10,000 tournament on Pixelborn run by Thea. We're used to these every couple of weeks, but a huge prize pool in this one, so lots of players really going for their best deck. We're going to start off with the most common decks to make the top 16, and then end up with the decks which only one player played. Starting off with Ruby Sapphire, 4 different players on Ruby Sapphire. Why did Ruby Sapphire perform so well this weekend? Well, Ruby Sapphire has a particularly strong matchup into Amber Steel Songs, which has been a very, very popular deck in the last couple weeks. And I think that Ruby Sapphire was a very logical choice for that reason. I do also want to mention, I've been very sick for the last week, hence the lack of videos, so forgive me if I'm kind of stumbling through this one a little bit more than usual. Okay, Ruby Sapphire, we've got Develop Your Brain, Popsicle, the kind of cards that we would expect. You've got the Fishbone Quill. Interestingly, no Mickey Mouse as a ramp option in this one, but there is the Matwani, which I've probably butchered, which is a really interesting ramp option when you're playing Ruby and Sapphire, and it's actually a card I'm really liking the look of. This card, if you have a card which is banished inside it, you gain 1 ink. So you play the Motwani on turn 2, and then on turn 3 you're looking to play your Stitch or your Queen of Hearts, banishing them and instantly gaining that ramp. So that's pretty interesting, because with the 5 willpower on this card, it's honestly pretty difficult to remove, and it can just gain you up that lore. One thing I think that Ruby Sapphire really needs is a way of gaining lore without questing, and this deck has 3 different ways of doing that. It has the Motwani early on, it has McDuck Mana for the mid game, and it has Lucky Dime to finish off the job later on. You've of course got your traditional control tools that you would expect with Maui, Be Prepared, Medusa. No Tremaine in this one, but there is also 1 copy of Scar and 4 copies of Maleficent Dragon. Also no surprises to see Tamatoa. You got Judy Hopps in there, potentially as answering some of your opponent's items. This can be very good against your opponent's Lucky Dimes, for example, and of course you can use it on your own stuff as well. All right, next Ruby Sapphire deck. Let's see, this one's playing 1 jump ahead. This one also has some copies of Shield of Virtue. Shield of Virtue is really good Flaversham fuel, just a cheap item to help you draw more cards, but also you can use it in a similar way to Maui's Fishhook. Instead of using Maui's Fishhook on Maui, for example, to get more damage, you can just spend that 3 on Maui and suddenly you can deal 12 damage with Maui in a single turn. This one has 2 Scars, 2 Tremaines, 2 Medusas compared to the 4 Medusas of the other build, 3 Gastons, which is similar. This one also rocking 3 copies of Let It Go. No Motwani in this one, also no Mickey Mouse, just relying on Fishbone Quill and 1 jump ahead as the ramp tools. Pretty interesting setup. 2 more Ruby Sapphire decks to look at. This one, 1 copy of Shield of Virtue, also going for the 1 jump ahead. Only 3 Be Prepareds in this one, which is really interesting to see. We have seen a few Ruby Amethyst decks only rocking 3 Be Prepared. I have to say I don't like the idea as much in Ruby Sapphire of only rocking 3 Be Prepareds. I think with how control heavy this deck is, I would personally like to play 4. I think in Ruby Amethyst it's quite interesting to only go for 3. I'm not sure I would agree with it in Ruby Sapphire. 1 copy of Hades maybe instead, 2 Scars. Very, very similar looking list. This one, again, with the 1 jump ahead and the Fishbone Quill. We're also seeing Grammatala in all of these lists, which is worth noting. A card I'm not a huge fan of, I have to say, but I think she does make a lot of sense, particularly if in the 1 jump ahead builds, you play the 1 jump ahead on turn 2, and then on turn 3, you can play Grammatala, which just gives you a body on the board while also replacing herself, right? She's adding to your hand. When you're playing against Emerald Steel in particular, having that body early on on the board, which also is also adding a card to hand, can be really important, because Emerald Steel can prove to be a pretty tricky matchup for this deck. And the final Ruby and Sapphire build, this one, 1 copy of Shield of Virtue, 1 Maui's Fishhook, 2 copies of Bell in this one, a 2-2 split between Medusa and Tremaine, 2 Dimes, 3 McDuck Manas, couple copies of Bell as I mentioned. Very, very similar looking lists. Probably the most interesting one, the Motwani, and then the other 3 all going for 1 jump ahead instead. In fact, this one, not 1 jump ahead, this one with Grammatala and Mickey Mouse. So all decks pretty similar, but different in the way that they're ramping up, which I find really, really fascinating. Yeah, really, really cool to see. If I had to pick one myself, I think the Motwani might be the way to go. You know, some early lore gain. The Stitch and Queen of Hearts help you stay in the early game. I don't know, though. Let me know which one you prefer. Perhaps we'll have some more answers based off which deck performs best. Also, Tamatoa, I think, in all 4 of these builds. So very similar lists. The main difference is really in the way to ramp up. Okay, now the next most common deck is Amber Steel Songs. In fact, there's a couple because there's only 2 of this deck. What deck variety we have? Amber Steel Songs, starting off with the big man, Brennan DeCanio, currently the front runner for best player in the game. Now, Brennan DeCanio, as a lot of you guys will know, likes to build decks with more than 60 cards when he's playing Amber Steel, which very much frustrates me. And he's done it again. 62 this time, which is significantly more acceptable than 66. Brennan DeCanio, like I say, amazing player. He's not really sure on what he wants to cut. And yeah, I think Amber Steel should be playing 60. It just improves the consistency of the deck overall. Gives you the cards on curve. But Brendan DeCanio still sticking with more than 60, which is fine. Not a big deal. Cinderella, Robin Hood, Queen on turn 1, just incredibly powerful. Then, of course, you're looking to shift in Robin Hood or the Queen. Maybe sing that whole new world nice and early on. You've got the big Cinderella. You guys know how this deck works, really, at this point. It's a super duper good deck. It would be the best deck in the game if it didn't have such a horrific matchup into Ruby Sapphire. Now, Brendan DeCanio did manage to beat a Ruby Sapphire player 2-0 in Swiss, so maybe they've got something up their sleeves for that matchup that I'm not aware of, but I think it's going to be a pretty tricky day 2 for Brennan. I actually believe he's queued into one of the Ruby Sapphire players in the first match of the top 16. List looks super good. If I was to just tweak it, I would of course make it a 60 card deck. I would probably remove Surfer Stitch. I would also always play 4 copies of Let the Storm Rage On. But I mean, the list looks great. Brendan DeCanio is the man. Great player. Can't really go wrong. All right, the other Amber Steel deck, I'm going to assume is 60 cards. A very similar looking one. This one has no copies of Surfer Stitch. Sleepy's Flute is the difference though. Brennan DeCanio going for Lantern. This one's Sleepy's Flute. We have seen a lot of people playing Pride Lands as well. There's kind of 3 different setups really. You go for Sleepy's Flute, Lantern, or Pride Lands in those slots. I like the Mr. Smee. Brennan not playing Smee. I think Smee is just such a good card even with low synergy, and when you're playing Amber, you have Rapunzel Smee synergy, which is pretty insane. So personally, I prefer the look of this list compared to Brennan's. Very similar. Sleepy's Flute definitely making a bit of a comeback as well. But yeah, pretty interesting overall to see. All right, up next, Ruby and Amethyst. I think there's just 2 versions of Ruby Amethyst in the top 16 as well. Ruby Amethyst is in a really interesting position in the current metagame where it's a deck which has good matchups across the board. However, it does feel slightly unfavored in all of those matchups. So Ruby Amethyst, I think, is probably a good deck to make top cut in tournaments, but we haven't really been seeing Ruby Amethyst win many events recently. It's a deck I personally would not play for that reason. This one, 3 copies of Be Prepared, 1 copy of Scar, which is not something you see that often. Maui's Fishhook making a bit of a comeback. Only 3 copies of Queen's Castle. No copies of Mini, which I find really surprising, actually. I think Mini is definitely the way to go, really, for these decks. Mini is particularly good against Emerald Steel, for example. It's also good against most Steel decks in general. Mini can be pretty difficult to remove. So I have to say, not in love with this list compared to... I don't know what this next list looks like exactly, but I would keep the list very similar. I think Mini is a must at this point in the meta. Maui's Fishhook, a little bit slow in general, good in the mirror for sure, but we've kind of seen people moving away from Maui's Fishhook and kind of going for the Minnie Mouse. Let's see if the next one has Minnie Mouse. It does have 1 copy of Fishhook. This is a list I like the look of a lot more instantly. Only 1 copy of Pinocchio. I think 1 or 2 Pinocchios is nice. Personally, I would play 1. I think Pinocchio is great, but you can definitely have issues if you hit 2 Pinocchios. You never want 2 Pinocchios in the opening hand, right? And 1 Pinocchio is enough to just be bouncing back. Of course, Pinocchio nice against Ursula. I also think the Teeth and Ambitions is an interesting inclusion as a 1 or 2 of. Also going to help you against Emerald Steel in particular. Like, as an Emerald Steel player, this deck scares me. This one, not so much. The reason that this one scares me a lot more is the Teeth and Ambitions, but moreover the Minnie Mouse. And I also find the 1 copy of Jim Hawkins to be really exciting. I think Queen's Castle is an amazing card. I would always play 4 of them in Ruby Amethyst, and therefore why not just run 1 copy of Jim? I really like the sound of it. The rest, pretty much standard as you would expect. 2 copies of Tremaine, 2 copies of Medusa. Seems like a reasonable split. I really like the look of this list. 1 copy of Fishhook is still in there. Very solid looking list. I think that this is the one I would recommend you guys playing more than this one, although full respect to Attack for 2. I think in the mirror, they're probably going to be more favored with that extra copy of Fishhook, and the Minnie Mouses are not particularly good in the mirror because of the Fishhook, so that's going to be interesting to see. Okay, up next we have Amethyst Emerald. I think there's 2 versions of Amethyst Emerald in the top cut, but they're very, very different. This one is a very mid-rangey approach. I am really interested in this deck, I have to say. I think that Amethyst Emerald still has so much potential that's been a little bit unexplored. There's so many interesting combos. We've seen some be very aggressive decks with cards like Cloud Kicker. You can go down a more discard-heavy route with Sudden Chill and Ursula, but this one is just a strictly more mid-range setup. You have Lyle Tiberius Rogue ×2, which is a very interesting card. I'm going to cough, apologies. I want to do it in one take. There's also a Lucifer in here, which can combine really, really nicely with Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. Only 3 copies of Ursula is quite fascinating, but if you go Ursula with Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo on a goat, don't quote me on this, someone will correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I think that's 6 lore at once, right? You play the goat, that's 1 lore, then you sing Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo with Ursula, so you bounce the goat back into hand, that's 2, then you replay the goat, that's 3, and then you sing the second copy of Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo, so the goat goes back, that's 4, play the goat again, that's 5. So 5 lore with Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo Ursula is pretty nuts. And that's, of course, 5 card draw with Merlin Rabbit and Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. So I think that's a really, really interesting combo. Also, Pinocchio. This deck just feels, to me, like a very similar deck to Ruby Amethyst, but instead of getting cards like Maui, you get the Ursula, the Bibbidi Bobbidi Boos, you get a bit of discard. This Ursula, the 2-cost Ursula, is a big, big reason that it's of interest, really. Overall, really exciting deck. You've got the Merlin Crab plus Cusco synergy. Elsa and Genie top end is also really exciting. The Lucifer in there too, and Wildcat for a bit of item removal. I honestly love the look of this deck. I think it's fascinating. I do think that Amethyst Emerald, like I say, has a lot of unexplored potential still. It's a deck that I'm really interested in playing some more of and experimenting with some different setups now that I'm not feeling quite so ill. Love the look of this one. Really, really cool to see. Next one, I'm pretty sure it's a different kind of take. And yeah, this one is more a tempo-orientated list. This one, interesting to note, no Merfolk and no Flynn, whereas this one does have the Merfolk, it does have the Flynn, so instantly a difference. Also has the Cloud Kicker. This one has the Yzma and 3 copies of Mother Knows Best. No copies of Mother Knows Best in this one. Mother Knows Best is kind of working in a similar way to Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. You can, of course, bounce your opponent's cards back, but you can also just bounce your own Rabbit, your own Merlin back. Yeah, so 2 different takes on Emerald Amethyst rather. This one more aggressive, this one more mid-rangey, but both decks definitely falling into that mid-range game plan a little bit. This one just being a quicker take on it. Really, really cool to see. Okay, up next, we also have 2 Sapphire Steel decks. Like, the deck variety is just amazing. Like, honestly, what a game. This one is 2 copies of Rise of the Titans, 2 copies of Bell. How many dimes? 2 dimes. Honestly, these are 1 copy of Fire the Cannons. So Fire the Cannons making a bit of an entrance into these Sapphire Steel decks helps you deal with Emerald Steel. Emerald Steel actually proving to be a pretty reasonable matchup into Sapphire Steel. It seemed like a really bad matchup initially, but once the Emerald Steel player finds the lines, it's honestly not a bad matchup for Emerald Steel, but the Fire the Cannons makes a huge difference. Of course, with Fishbone Quill, this Fire the Cannons can be inked quite consistently. 3 copies of Grab Your Sword is a lot, but that's also going to be a card which is very good against Emerald Steel. Just 1 copy of Let It Go, 1 copy of Zeus as well. Very good deck. Surprised there's not more in the top 16. Up next, 3 copies of Fire the Cannons. A Robin Hood and a Robin Hood Shift. 2 Bengers. 3 Zeus, Tamato. Okay, this is a spicy list. Holy. Okay, this is very, very different. 3 copies of Bell. So, one thing you can do with Bell in this deck is you play Bell nice and early, and then you sing A Whole New World because you can, like, ink 2 cards from hand in 1 turn with Bell, right? So, Bell can become, like, her own mini Fishbone Quill. So, you can go 1 jump ahead on 2, then turn 3 you can Bell, and then you try and Whole New World shortly thereafter. Really fascinating. Still got the Cogsworth, still got a dime. No Gastons. Really, really interesting to note. 3 Zeus. The Fire the Cannons is terrifying as well if you're a Emerald Steel player, as well as the 3 copies of Swords. Only 3 Smees, no hooks. I am quite liking the idea of playing hook, less Smees, but honestly, Smee with Cogsworth, I would probably still be playing 4 Smees, but this is a fascinating list. Tamatoa in there as well. Really, really cool to see the different takes on Sapphire Steel. This one kind of more what you expect with the McDuck Manor, Rise of the Titans. This one, yeah, really, really cool to see the variety. Okay, up next we have Emerald Steel. There's two versions of Emerald Steel as well. The deck variety is insane. Emerald Steel's a great deck. It's another deck similar to Ruby and Amethyst, that it just has really good matchups across the board. It doesn't have any bad matchups particularly. It's got some slightly unfavored matchups, arguably, into Songs, also into Sapphire Steel, you could argue. Also, I am quite fearful of Ruby and Amethyst if they play Mini and Queen's Castle as a Emerald Steel player, but also the Ruby Amethyst player needs to really know what they're doing. This first deck is capping out at 5 ink, so the biggest disparity we're seeing in Emerald Steel at the moment is what you cap out at. Initially it was 6 with Tinkerbells and Robin Hoods, then we've seen some players going down to 5. Even I actually, in my tournament in Poland, which I finished 4th in last week, I actually capped out at 4 ink, mainly because I don't So this is the biggest surprise package deck, really, of the top cut. Very, very interesting to see. Kind of a similar approach to my Jafar deck, like I mentioned, but without the Jafar. Maybe you have a slightly better matchup into Amber Steel songs. I would wager that this deck is not going to perform too well in the top 16. I'm surprised to see it, but I'm excited to see it. I don't have the highest hopes for it, though, if I'm honest. It looks just a little bit wet noodle. It's like an aggressive deck with some control. It's really cool to see, but I don't have high hopes for it. But we'll have to wait and see. All right, guys, that's the top 16 decks from the meta, from TBC's 10K tournament. 4 Ruby Sapphire decks. We had 2 Amber Steel decks, 2 Ruby Amethyst decks, 2 Emerald Steel decks, 2 Sapphire Steel, 2 Emerald Steel, and 1 Amber Ruby Mufasa, and 1 Amethyst Steel aggro. What a meta we have. What a game, guys. So I'm going to be doing a full in-depth meta report probably tomorrow or Tuesday, where I'm going to try and help you guys pick the best decks for the store championships, talk about which decks have good matchups and whatnot. Have a lovely rest of your day. Give it a like if you watch this far, and see you very soon.